Good day, I am Karl Marx. I welcome you all to Socio-Exploration. In this video, I will take you through my life journey, my theories, and my lasting contributions to sociology and political thought. I was born on May 5, 1818, in the city of Trier, in the Kingdom of Prussia, modern-day Germany. I am known across the world as the father of scientific socialism, the father of Marxism, a revolutionary thinker, and a founding father of sociology. My family was of Jewish ancestry, but my father, Heinrich Marx, converted to Lutheranism before I was born, largely for professional reasons, as Jews were restricted from public service. He was a lawyer, a man of Enlightenment values, deeply interested in philosophy and reason. From him, I inherited not only intellect, but also a rebellious spirit. I was the third of 9 children. Ours was a warm, cultured household filled with books, debates, and liberal thinking. I was a bright student and eventually studied at the University of Bonn and later at the University of Berlin, where I was drawn to the philosophy of Hegel. Hegelian idealism intrigued me, but I would eventually turn it on its head. While in Berlin, I joined the Young Hegelians, a radical group of intellectuals who questioned religion, politics, and the existing order. I earned a doctorate in philosophy at age 23, but my political views were too controversial for a university position. Instead, I became a journalist, and soon the editor of a liberal newspaper, Rheinische Zeitung. But my writings on social injustice and government repression quickly got the paper shut down by the authorities. In 1843, I married my childhood friend and the love of my life, Jenny von Westphalen, a baron's daughter, no less. She stood by me through years of poverty and exile. We had 7 children, though only 3 survived into adulthood. We endured many personal tragedies, illness, malnutrition, even the loss of children, while fighting for a vision of a better world. My political convictions soon made me a man without a country. I was exiled from Germany, then France, then Belgium, and eventually settled in London in 1849, where I would spend the rest of my life. Life in London was far from easy. We were often destitute, relying on support from my dear friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels, who worked in his family's textile business in Manchester. Without Engels, I might not have survived. In 1848, we co-wrote the Communist Manifesto, a call to arms for the working class. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. It was a short pamphlet, but its message shook the world. We argued that all of history was a struggle between classes, and that capitalism, like feudalism before it, would one day fall, giving way to a classless, communist society. Throughout the 1850s and 60s, I worked tirelessly, often in the British Museum reading room, to produce my magnum opus, Das Kapital. The first volume was published in 1867. The later volumes were incomplete when I died, but Engels would finish them from my notes. It was a scientific analysis of capitalism, exploring how profit is made through the exploitation of labor. Though my personal life was marked by poverty, loss, and poor health, I never gave up on the cause of the working class. My beloved Jenny died in 1881, followed by our daughter Jenny Caroline. These losses crushed me. I became increasingly ill, withdrawn, and melancholy. I died on March 14, 1883, in London, at the age of 64. Only a few people attended my funeral, but my ideas, those lived on. The movements, revolutions, and critiques that followed all bear the mark of my vision for a world free from exploitation. Let me guide you through my works. First is the historical materialism. When I say historical materialism, I mean that material conditions, how people live, work, and produce what they need to survive, are the foundation of society. Ideas, religion, art, and laws are important, but they arise from and reflect those material realities. Let me put it plainly. To understand how a society works or changes, Look first at its economic structure, not just its philosophy or politics. Class conflict as the engine of history. I famously wrote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." This means that every major era of human history has been shaped by a struggle between those who own the means of production and those who do not. These class conflicts are not accidental. They are built into the structure of each society. The stages of societal development. Based on material conditions, societies evolve through specific stages. First stage, primitive communism. In early tribal societies, there was no private property. People worked together and shared the products of their labor. There were no classes yet. Second stage, slavery. As surplus production emerged, some began to own others. A class of slave owners exploited slaves to extract wealth. Third stage, feudalism. In medieval Europe, land was the key resource. Lords owned land and peasants, serfs, worked it. Again, one class dominated another. Fourth stage, capitalism. With the rise of industry, the bourgeoisie, capitalists, took control of factories and markets. The proletariat, workers, sell their labor for wages, but the capitalists keep the profit. This system thrives on exploitation and inequality. Fifth stage, socialism and communism. Future stages. Eventually, I believe workers will rise up, overthrow the capitalist system, and create a classless society where production is owned collectively, not privately. Internal contradictions lead to change. Each system contains its own downfall. For example, in feudalism, the rise of trade and towns undermined the old land-based economy. In capitalism, the very success of industrial production leads to overproduction, crisis, inequality, and worker unrest. These tensions build until the system can no longer sustain itself. A revolution occurs, and a new system replaces the old. So I don't see history as random or driven by abstract ideas. It follows laws, just like nature, laws based on material conditions and class relations. My other notable work, The Class Struggle. When you look at the history of society, any society, you will find one pattern repeating again and again: the struggle between classes. This is what I mean by class struggle. From ancient empires to modern industrial societies, social change has always been driven by conflict between those who control economic resources and those who are exploited by them. What is a class? A class is not just a group of people with similar incomes. It's defined by their relationship to the means of production, that is, the tools, factories, land, and capital used to produce goods. In capitalism, the two main classes are the bourgeoisie. They own the means of production. They are the capitalists, the factory owners, the bankers, the ruling economic class. The proletariat. They own nothing but their labor power, which they must sell to survive. They are the working class, the laborers, factory workers, miners, clerks. These two classes are locked in opposition because their interests are fundamentally different. The bourgeoisie seeks profit, which means paying workers as little as possible. The proletariat seeks fair wages and humane conditions, which cuts into profit. Why is class struggle central to history? I argued that class conflict is the engine of history, the driving force behind all major social transformations. Here's how it works. In ancient societies, it was masters versus slaves. In feudal societies, it was lords versus serfs. In modern capitalist societies, it is bourgeoisie versus proletariat. These struggles don't just lead to tension, they lead to revolution. When the oppressed class becomes aware of its exploitation, a process I call class consciousness, it organizes, fights back, and overthrows the ruling class. From oppression to emancipation, I believed that the working class would eventually unite across national and cultural boundaries, rise up in revolution, and establish a new system, socialism, where the means of production are collectively owned. In this system, there would be no more classes, no more exploitation. This is the goal, a classless communist society. But this is not a utopia born from imagination. It is, in my view, the inevitable outcome of the contradictions of capitalism. The seeds of its destruction lie within its own success. So class struggle is not just a part of history. It is the very heartbeat of history. Wherever there is inequality, there will be resistance, and from resistance, there will be change. Why is class struggle central to history? I argued that class conflict is the engine of history, the driving force behind all major social transformations. Here's how it works. In ancient societies, it was masters versus slaves. In feudal societies, it was lords versus serfs. In modern capitalist societies, it is bourgeoisie versus proletariat. These struggles don't just lead to tension, they lead to revolution. When the oppressed class becomes aware of its exploitation, a process I call class consciousness, it organizes, fights back, and overthrows the ruling class. From oppression to emancipation, I believed that the working class would eventually unite across national and cultural boundaries, rise up in revolution, and establish a new system, socialism, where the means of production are collectively owned. In this system, there would be no more classes, no more exploitation. This is the goal, a classless communist society. But this is not a utopia born from imagination. It is, in my view, the inevitable outcome of the contradictions of capitalism. The seeds of its destruction lie within its own success. So, class struggle is not just a part of history, it is the very heartbeat of history. Wherever there is inequality, there will be resistance. And from resistance, there will be change. In the heart of the modern capitalist system lies something deeply disturbing, not just economic inequality, but a more personal, spiritual kind of suffering. I called this condition alienation. To be alienated is to be estranged from your work, from others, and even from yourself. Under capitalism, I saw that the worker becomes a stranger in the world they themselves help to create. Their labor is no longer an expression of their humanity, but something forced, fragmented, and owned by someone else. Let me explain the 4 dimensions of alienation that I identified. First, alienation from the product of labor. When you, the worker, create something in a factory, whether it's a shoe, a table, or a car, you don't own it. It becomes the property of the capitalist. You spend your energy, time, and skill on something that is immediately taken from you. Your labor creates value, but the value doesn't belong to you. This separation between you and what you create leads to deep dissatisfaction. Second, alienation from the process of labor. In capitalism, you don't decide how or when to work. You follow orders. You repeat the same mechanical actions, hour after hour. Work becomes meaningless drudgery, not a creative or fulfilling act. Instead of labor being a reflection of your human potential, it becomes external to you, something you do only to survive. Third, alienation from other people. Because of competition and private ownership, you are not united with your fellow workers. You are often competing against them for jobs, wages, and survival. Capitalism turns human beings into commodities, things to be bought and sold. Rather than cooperation and solidarity, capitalism promotes individualism, isolation, and mistrust. Fourth, alienation from human nature, species being. Human beings at their core are creative, social, and conscious. Our species being is defined by our capacity to work freely, with purpose and in connection with others. But under capitalism, this nature is distorted. Labor becomes mechanical. Creativity is suppressed. You are reduced to a cog in the machine. You become less human in the very act of working, which should be a humanizing force. Why it matters. Alienation is not just a philosophical idea. It's a real experience for millions of workers. They feel powerless, disconnected, and unfulfilled. and yet society tells them to blame themselves, not the system. I believed that true freedom comes only when workers regain control over their labor, when work becomes a collective, meaningful activity, not a tool for someone else's profit. That is why I called for the abolition of private property, not to destroy individual freedom, but to restore our collective humanity. Capitalism alienates us from what we do, from what we make, from one another, and from who we truly are. Only a new kind of society, socialist, cooperative, classless, can bring us back to ourselves. One of the most crucial ideas in my critique of capitalism is the concept of surplus value. This is the secret behind how capitalists make profit, and why I argue that capitalism is inherently exploitative. Let me explain. Where does profit come from? In capitalist society, you might think that profit comes from cleverness, investment, or hard work by the owner. But this is an illusion. Profit comes from the exploitation of labor. When a worker is hired, they are paid a wage, let's say enough to cover the cost of food, housing, and other basic needs. This is what I call the value of labor power. But here's the trick. The worker produces much more value during the working day than the value they are paid in wages. The creation of surplus value. Imagine a worker is paid the equivalent of $50 a day, which represents the value of their labor power. Now, in the first few hours of the day, the worker produces goods worth $50. They've paid back their wage and value. But the capitalist doesn't let them go home. The worker continues to work for several more hours, producing goods worth $100, $200, or more. That extra value, beyond what the worker is paid, is what I call surplus value. And who keeps that surplus? The capitalist. Why? It's exploitation. This is not a fair exchange. The worker is not paid for the full value they create. Their labor is treated as a commodity, and they receive only a portion of what it's worth. The surplus value extracted from workers becomes profit for the capitalist, used to expand factories, buy machines, pay shareholders, or simply accumulate wealth. Capital grows, not by magic, but by unpaid labor. I also distinguish between two forms of increasing surplus value. First, absolute surplus value. O, extending the working hours without increasing wages. O, example, making a worker work 12 hours instead of 8 for the same pay. Second, relative surplus value. O, increasing productivity through technology or speed, so the worker creates more in less time. O, the worker still receives the same wage, but the capitalist gains more value per hour. In both cases, the worker is not compensated for the extra value they produce. The role in capitalism. Surplus value is the lifeblood of capitalism. Without it, there would be no profit and no accumulation of capital. That's why capitalists are always trying to reduce wages, lengthen working hours, or increase productivity, not to help the worker, but to extract more surplus value. Surplus value is unpaid labor. It is the hidden engine of profit, the source of inequality, and the root of worker exploitation. I revealed this to expose the structural injustice of the system, not to blame individuals, but to change the system itself. Throughout my life, I have said this clearly and without apology. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. This is not just a slogan. It is a call to action, rooted in historical necessity and my analysis of capitalism's internal contradictions. I did not merely hope for revolution. I argued that it was inevitable. Why revolution? Capitalism, I have shown, is built on exploitation. The bourgeoisie extracts surplus value from workers. Over time, as capital accumulates in fewer hands, inequality deepens. The workers are pushed into poverty and alienation, while the capitalists enjoy luxury and control. But capitalism also creates its own gravediggers. The proletariat, the working class, becomes larger, more concentrated, and more conscious of its collective power. When workers realize they are being exploited not as individuals, but as a class, they develop class consciousness. At this point, they can unite and rise up, not in chaos, but in a deliberate struggle to overthrow the system. The revolution, in my vision, would unfold in stages. First, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie or the working class seizes the means of production, factories, land, and capital. Private property, in its capitalist form, is abolished. The aim is not to seize luxury goods for everyone, but to end exploitation. Second, the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional phase, where the working class rules in the interest of the majority. This is not oppression, but liberation, a necessary step to dismantle capitalist structures and prevent counter-revolution. Third, the withering away of the state. Eventually, when class distinctions vanish, the state, used historically to enforce class rule, will no longer be needed. In its place will emerge a classless, stateless, communist society. What is communism? Contrary to what many think, communism is not about forced equality or state control of everything. It is about the end of class society, where the means of production are commonly owned. Labor is free and fulfilling, not coerced. Goods are produced for human need, not profit. People contribute according to their ability and receive according to their need. Communism is the full realization of human freedom and potential. It is not a dream. It is the next stage in human history, a history driven always by class struggle. In the Communist Manifesto, which I co-wrote with Friedrich Engels in 1848, we declared, "Workers of the world, unite." This was not mere poetry. It was a recognition that the struggle of workers is global, and so must be their solidarity. Only through revolution can we escape the chains of exploitation. Only through communism can we build a society based on justice, equality, and human dignity. I was never a man of wealth or comfort, but I devoted my life to understanding the forces that shape human society. Through hunger, exile, and loss, I continued to write, because the working class deserved the truth behind their suffering. Let me tell you about my key works, not just as a scholar, but as a man committed to revolution. My first writing, The Communist Manifesto, 1848. Workers of the world, unite. I wrote this with my comrade and dear friend Friedrich Engels. It was commissioned by the Communist League, and we intended it as a rallying cry for the proletariat. In this short but potent manifesto, we laid bare the history of class struggle, from slave and master to lord and serf to capitalist and worker. We explained that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that revolution is not only possible but necessary. It was not just theory. It was a declaration of war against exploitation. The second Das Kapital, Volume the Fun, 1867, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1852. France gave me rich material to analyze. In this political essay, I examined how Napoleon III rose to power by exploiting class divisions and public confusion. I showed that even when people seem to repeat history, they do so under very different circumstances. As I famously wrote, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. It was my attempt to demonstrate how material conditions shape political events. The seventh writing is Wage, Labor, and Capital, 1847. These were lectures I gave to explain capitalism to workers in simple terms. I explained what wages are, how labor is exploited, and how profit is made not by ingenuity, but by paying workers less than the value they produce. This served as a primer for Das Kapital, helping ordinary people see how the system that feeds them also devours them. The eighth writing are Theses on Feuerbach, 1845. In just 11 brief theses, I broke with the passivity of earlier philosophy. My final words in this short piece remain some of the most quoted. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. That was my mission, not merely to observe, but to act. Not merely to study, but to liberate. I did not write for kings or academics. I wrote for workers, for the poor, for those chained by exploitation and longing to be free. My words were weapons, and my pen a sword for revolution. Do like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for further notifications. Danke und einen schönen Tag noch.